We're back, or I'm back, but I have a guest. Here we go. Live. No, it's recorded. Trudy Seven Lands, I am Rohadi, coming at you for the Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast, season 4, the author edition. Hey, you can support this podcast by throwing your money at it. Go and check out rohadi.com, and it will have all the details you need on how you can support the work that I'm doing on decentering whiteness and decolonizing Christianity and the church, and all the different friends and new friends that I have come on the show. Check out that info at Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast, wherever podcasts are sold. This edition features my friend Charlotte Donlan. She lives in Alabama. I value her voice online. There is a level of vulnerability and honesty that attracts me to voices such as Charlotte's, because in that honesty, in that leadership, I think there's a level of integrity. There's a saying that says, don't follow a leader who doesn't walk with a limp. So vulnerability is the currency in our world, I think, right now, one of the currencies. Charlotte has a book that came out recently called On Belonging, and it has a depth of insight on practices of vulnerability, but also her story on belonging and loneliness. The Great Belonging, how loneliness leads us to each other, now available wherever books are sold. We talk about this book in part 1. Part 2, we go even deeper around the narratives of loneliness and her story. We unpack aspects of her story. And I think depending on where you've been with the struggle with loneliness, and we've all been there, you're going to have some moments here we might have to pause the podcast and come back to it, because there's just depth and an understanding of the human condition that comes out in both a portrayal of honesty, but Charlotte's story of vulnerability, and one she's willing to share with us so that we can be vulnerable and honest with our own stories of loneliness, vulnerability, and the chase to belong. Enough from me. Let's jump right in. So I have trouble with white people's names. Charlotte, Donlon, Donlon. Maybe that's too French.
It's Donlan. Close.
Donlan.
Donlan. Yeah, it's Irish.
Irish.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
We're going to dive into your book here, but it's always important to draw near to the stories of where our visitors, our guests on the podcast are from, what part of the land they are from, what city you live in, and who are your people?
Yeah, so my husband is pretty much 100% Irish. His both of his parents' families came over 2 or 3 generations back from Ireland. I have a little bit of Irish in me from my side of, from my parents and ancestors. My maiden name is Bird, B-Y-R-D, and all of the Birds are very proud of themselves. So I have done some ancestry.com work, going back on both sides of the family, my husband's and mine.
Yeah.
But the bird work has already been done because all these birds are very proud. So it's been interesting. I only started that during the pandemic, doing this research. I guess it was one way I was trying to keep living and learning, and I just got interested in it. And for some reason, I want to say around April of this year, and it was good. It was good to find out. I'm kind of on pause now, but it's interesting to see my husband's, the research people have done on his side of the family, because there's a lot more secrets, it seems like, like family secrets. And, was
Oh,
this
okay.
person the father, or was
It could
that
be like
person the
a
father? And I'm
TV
sure that's
show.
in the Bird side of the family too. But I think the Birds are just better at covering that stuff up.
Do you have anyone famous? Did you have a aha
I,
discovery moment?
well, we are related to the Colonel William Birds that founded Richmond, Virginia. And there's a father and a son, both named, I mean, my dad was William Byrd, my brother's William. There are lots of William Byrds. I forget which one, but I mean, they all owned slaves. And one of them, there's like diary entries about how he treated his slaves. And that was an interesting aha moment. I mean, a lot of
Hmm.
people, like historians, are aware of this, but reading those entries, I would say I read those entries maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Um, and just seeing how awful it was. Like, it was like a normalized awfulness. And he just wrote about it like it was just like, it was just normal. And it was infuriating and shocking to
Yeah.
see those words. Um,
How
yeah.
did you process them?
Well, it really helped me. I mean, I've always, since I've been a Christian, for 25 years or so, been very much struck by corporate sin. Okay, like, it's
Mm.
not just an individual thing, it's a corporate thing, and there are systems and frameworks. And I didn't have the language for like systemic racism 5 years ago. I mean, I wish I did, but I didn't. But that is what I was grappling with. And, how am I connected to that, that many years ago? Like, that some of that blood is in me, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, I, it kind of made it more like flesh and bloodish for me, the idea of corporate sin and what I now know as systemic
Mm.
racism and white supremacy. It just made it more real. And the
It became part of your
idea,
story.
yeah, part of my story. And like, is my DNA, like, is that's my DNA,
Yeah.
like, not just
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
story, but like my body and my, and then the
Yeah.
body, think about the bodies of those who were enslaved by my ancestors. And I don't know, I think it became more corporal. Is that the right word? Like bodily.
Mm.
So,
That's really curious that you. So I picked up pieces of details, but I'll assume that you. Well, I shouldn't assume because then you kind of had more of a mainline presence in your book. But did you grow up in a church, but in more of an evangelical kind of space?
I actually grew up in the Methodist church,
Okay.
um, mainline, but I
Yeah.
was not a believer. I didn't understand the gospel or believe the gospel until I was in college. And at that point, I did join a church that was more evangelical and like, contemporary worship type thing. That pastor actually preached a lot about grace, and it was really good for me to have a like robust foundation of a theology of grace at that point in my life. And that has carried on throughout the
Mm.
last 20 years, and it's still a huge part of who I am and like my theology. But now I'm in the Episcopal Church. We've been in the Episcopal Church for about 4 years. We just left our local body a few weeks ago.
Oh,
And
really?
there's another Episcopal church that I'm kind of curious about. I mean, I've gone to morning prayer there. They do weekday morning prayer, which I love, but it's hard in the middle of a pandemic to really church shop. I mean, you can watch sermons online, which is good. Like in some ways it's easy to church shop. In some ways it's not. And then I start feeling guilty about church shopping. I'm like, what, I have all of these options, especially here in Birmingham, there's like churches everywhere. And, but there are very good reasons why we left that other church. And, I don't know, we stayed in a church. Let me think. We helped plant a church starting in 2001. Maybe meetings might have started in the year 2000, but the first worship service was in 2001. And we were there until, we were there about 15 years. And leaving, we should have left sooner. There was a whole big story about that. The founding pastor had an affair with an elder's wife, and things fell apart, of course. But we stayed. We're very loyal, and we stayed through the transition and through a lot of other things. And by the time we left, I was like, man, we should have done that way sooner. So I don't know. I mean, I could talk about all that forever, but so now I wonder, I'm like, well, did we leave too soon, this other church? But I don't think we did. I mean, the problem with Birmingham, Alabama is that if you read Letter from a Birmingham Jail that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote many years ago to white pastors in this city, everything is still the same. So I feel like there's this oppressive thing in Birmingham specifically, and sure it's other places too, but I think there is this special kind of brokenness and blindness of the churches here.
So you can feel a certain level of power, or a different kind of unique power in your place.
Yes, I do think there are certain powers and principalities that are at work here that are at work other places too, but here in a unique way. And I have a lot of friends who have moved away from Birmingham, and they tell me there are other church, there are other ways to do church that don't exist here. And I am generalizing. I haven't been to every church in this city, and I don't mean to I love Birmingham. I love this place, and I think that's why it's so heartbreaking, right? Because why can't we find a church where we are hearing the gospel and people who really believe what Jesus said and who he is and who he came for and who he exists for. So it's complicated.
I was going to say, isn't that ironic? But sometimes that's just the reality in your place, about how a place saturated with churches could potentially be so far away from truth. Of course, whose truth would be the next question, but I asked that question because it struck me as your picture of how you approached sin as being, from the get-go, really through a lens of or included the corporate reality of that, is certainly something that's countercultural to prevailing trends in the Protestant traditions, especially in North America, that tends to individualize all those things and internalize.
Well, and I do have individual sins too.
Okay.
I will say that.
Yeah, okay.
In case anyone's wondering, I do.
Let's talk about your place just a little bit. This podcast is lots of folks listen to it from across the continent, but it also is rooted in a Canadian context. Canada has this weird fascination with America. We get every American thing pretty much. All your TV shows and very much shaped by the same cultural aspects. So the for example, the fear and the use of fear to set policy and hope is something that's very much akin and happening in our context, especially in my province. I live in the Texas of the North. Alberta is or maybe it's the Alabama of the North, very conservative. And part of the realities of that is it's had the worst just now response to COVID, trying to open the door to those individual liberties. It's more libertarian in that sense. Paint us just again, broad strokes, but a picture of your place, of your city, and what the reality is. You gave us a picture a little bit of the church reality and also the racialized reality of what the feeling of oppression that is still lingering. What is the current reality on top of that? And the most acute piece, of course, being the pandemic in your midst.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So I live in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm actually right now living in a suburb of Birmingham, right on the border of the city of Birmingham. My husband and I moved to the city from this suburb when we had been married about 5 years. And we lived in the city of Birmingham for about 13 years. And then we came back to this suburb. My daughter has mild autism, and we needed a school system that had more services. And the public schools here are really great. And this particular suburb is more diverse than, say, some of the other suburbs. All of that to say, it's very different living in the city of Birmingham and living outside of the city of Birmingham.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, but within our county, Jefferson County, we are a blue kind of dot amidst this red state. And by blue, I mean barely blue, like maybe 55 to 60% voted for Hillary Clinton. And I think around that same percentage of this county voted for Biden. But with that, there are, plenty of people who would be at home in Alberta, it sounds like. And it's hard because there are also some amazing people here. And then I get stuck because I'm like, the people who I disagree with politically and whatever, like, I don't want to demonize all of these people, but at the same time, I don't understand. Like, I have tried for 4 years to understand how Trump got elected, and I can't, except from what you just said about this fear. I mean, I have, there are all kinds of ideas about that, and, white people afraid of losing power and influence, and using fear to convince people that the crazy libs are going to take away their guns and everything. And I don't understand how Christians, and look at the racism piece and the white supremacy and all of that and still vote for him. Like, that is like that's where I stop. I'm like, this exists, right? So I'm not going to vote for him. And I knew that from the beginning. And when he was elected, and I realized that, 81% of white evangelicals voted for him, I felt betrayed by the church, because I had been taught all of these things about moral integrity and, the image of God, and how we're all created in the image of God. And I'm like, what? How can this many people vote for him? So I'm surrounded by people who vote for him, who go to church, and have different ideas of what it looks like to live in light of the gospel and to notice God's presence in their lives and in the world around them and in the people around them. And I've had a lot of anger and I think, legitimate anger about that. But I'm still grappling with how to exist in that. And at the same time, I'm like, how did I simmer in these waters and not end up like that? Like how? So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's complicated. I said that earlier about something else, but right now people aren't wearing masks as much as they should. Kids at my kids' high school are getting COVID and people are being contact traced. So if you are within a student who gets it for 15 minutes, you have to go home for 12 days or whatever. And I don't understand why people aren't more concerned about the common good. Like that's probably what it all boils down to with regard to the pandemic. It's just not that tricky to me. It's and I don't understand why it's hard to wear a mask or why people feel threatened that their individual rights are being taken away. And I don't know how much of that is media and social media and certain networks that and certain publications that don't publish things that are true. And but I also think it's just exposing things that were already there.
Oh, for sure.
So Trump getting elected exposed things that were already there. I didn't see them. I should have listened to my Black friends more, and I should have paid more attention, and I should not have been as shocked in 2016 as I was. I should not be as shocked at the response to the pandemic as I am. But at the same time, I think being shocked is like that thing inside of me that wants justice and that wants goodness and that wants all of us to flourish. So I don't know if I don't ever want to be not shocked. And I hope I just said that sentence right. But at the same time, it's exhausting, right? And there are other people here in my community, in my city, in this area that agree with a lot of what I just said. A lot of people in the church who agree with that. I would say most of the churches here are like majority people who voted for Trump. And I don't think I've heard any pastor from the left, the right, the top, the bottom, the middle, like call any of it out in a way that emphasizes confession and repentance. Like I mentioned my robust theology of grace, right? So if we believe the gospel, we receive grace to be able to confess and repent, right? And say, okay, I have been a part of this framework of white supremacy. I have oppressed other people, and I want to confess that sin, and I want to turn from it and do things in a different way now. And that's corporate and that's individual. And I don't hear any pastors anywhere saying any of that.
Why do you think that is?
I mean,
I have a hunch.
I think one reason is because they, their tithes come from people and members who don't want to hear that.
That's the pragmatic one.
They don't want to make certain people mad. But I guess they're not worried about me being mad. They sanitize the gospel. And I think they're in the South, okay, in Alabama, there's, we're supposed to be kind, right? Or nice is probably a better word. Because if we're nice about our faith, then people will be attracted to it and they'll become Christians. And it's just not true. Like if you're nice while dismissing the reality of the world around you, like no one is going to be attracted to that, in my opinion. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think it is?
I was just thinking as you said, nice is just a guise to keep things the same.
Yep.
I think as you were sharing that story, to work backwards, we don't see it or in the white Protestant white Catholic traditions, you don't see it because they've never been taught how. Mm. And there's never been a reason to repent corporately, especially when the world matches your gaze. You assume that everything's operating just fine. And so as you crumble that world, that you realize that your perceptions are wrong, you just have no capacity, have no training, have no memory of what it means or looks like to repent corporately. And I think that works against the fundamental, and Canada's the same, piece of American culture surrounding individualism. Mm-hmm. So why aren't more Christians in the South, any Christians really, why aren't they more interested in the flourishing of all people? And I think it's because we don't care about all people. We care about ourselves.
Right.
And it's you use another word, the common good. Like, why wouldn't more people care about the common good? That's because everything is rooted in me, in the individual. Manifest destiny. What's the other one? The American dream. The American dream's rooted in how far the self can go. Just hard work, and you too can make it. And just the roots of all the systems, capitalism, for example, you race to the bottom to produce as much as you can, under the assumption of capitalism is that all goods and services are scarce, rather than a picture that God provides abundance.
Right.
And so I think culturally it pushes, and the gospel should, against our fundamental assumptions of who we are. So it's a question of identity. Mm. And that's not just a white Christian problem. I think that stretches beyond. But it's certainly rooted in the primary narratives in our countries, of which the voting, so in your case, Trump, and still, I looked at this yesterday. I don't remember the context, but so Biden winds up with the most votes ever with 81 million or something like that. But Trump, if there was no Biden vote there, Trump would have had the most votes ever at something like 70-something million, I think. And it's just like, it's still. So there's a slow shift. I firmly believe that. But when you challenge identity and white identity, where there's nothing else, like you run out of things to cling to. And that's why so many cling to their, let's say, guns, or cling to their individual liberties being one, or their individual liberty to worship, which is our problem here. And it's very rare in comparison. So we don't have the gun problem necessarily, but we have the anti-maskers and the churches who insist on gathering. Again, very small minority, but it's a revelation of this undercurrent of where your identity is rooted. And I echo. That makes me mad.
Well, it makes me mad too, especially because it's like I really believe what these people were preaching to me, right? Like I do believe that my theology and who I am today has been formed by the teaching and preaching, in part by the teaching and preaching I've heard and learned. And I'm like, why y'all aren't believing what you preached to me, or it's not as important as you made it seem, or like there's this disconnect, and it makes me feel very isolated from the church. I think a lot of people feel very isolated from the church because of this stuff, and we don't really know what to do with it, like, I want to be in a church. I really do. But I look at the whole thing and I'm like, why do I want to be a part of this? And, you mentioned identity. It's not just the white individual identity, it's our white church's identity. And I need to learn more about this. And I have some books on my list to read about it. But like the idea that the white American church is rooted in white supremacy. And how can we be, as a church, something we've never been before? Which is what I think you were touching on just a bit ago.
And I'm skeptical that it can shift, but I don't have God-sized vision, perhaps. That's why. But the witness of the church, the first go-around with Trump, even prior to that, it's just slowly been eroding. The mainstream witness of the church. In America, the conservative branch is far more powerful. The religious conservative branch is far more powerful than in Canada. But it's still a little bit vocal. So these are factors that have reared itself over and over again, and I think it's losing, both demographically, just in a normal shift, but also the witness. More and more people are realizing, and more Christians too, so inside and outside of the church, that this church is not standing for the things it should. Like, there's enough nascent understanding in popular culture that knows that, in the very least, the church is not supposed to be about these things. In the very least, right? Outsiders even know that. And so I think it is and this has been going on since the boomers. So if you want to track church attendance, and the high watermark of church attendance being in the 50s, of which Canadians attended church more as a percentage of population than Americans, which is weird. Only in the 50s, though, at that high. And then ever since then, both countries it's just been falling straight into the pavement. In Canada, it's like 8 to 12% maybe are evangelical now. And people go to monthly services. I have to pull up what that stat is, but it's around that too, about 12% maybe. So it's a small amount, and more people are just leaving because they feel either isolated or they don't believe in that God anymore. I don't blame them. Same.
I mean, when I read about the Black Jesus, I'm like, okay, that sounds like Jesus to me, right? But and I follow a lot of Black theologians and read Black theologians. I'm trying to read more, but I've had Black friends tell me, we don't want you to come into our church. And I'm like, I get it. You want a space where white people aren't coming up in there. But what I think we can receive from the Black church is a theological perspective that gives us a broader view of the gospel that's rooted in the truth. So will white people listen to that? I mean, I think, like you said, I think more people are. And I even think more people are since George Floyd was killed. Like, I do know people who have been transformed since then because of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests, and seeing things that have been hidden from some of us, and hearing things that have been hidden from some of us. So, I mean, I think there are reasons to hope, but it's just the brokenness of the current moment is so big. Like, it's very overwhelming to me.
I have a sense of the same hope that you or share that you have, but I think it comes in a different package now, as there's an iteration of a new imagination of what both this faith and this church can look like. It's going to take some work. It's going to take some aspects of returning to your words of common good and the flourishment of myself, my community, but my neighbor, the other as well,
Mhm.
and a sense of just a vulnerability and a humanness to it all. That kind of segues us neatly into your book. Your book, The Great Belonging, came out this year. When did it come out? In the fall, 2020?
Yes, November 10th,
Oh,
2020, just
yeah.
1 week after the election.
Okay, we're dating this.
Yeah,
This
great
will come out a
timing.
couple of months after, but so that's brand new. And I kind of saw your postings along the way leading up into the release of The Great Belonging, how loneliness leads us to each other. The first thing that struck me about this book as I was going through it was there is a picture of vulnerability here, of refreshing honesty with your words that is lacking in so much of contemporary Christian literature. So thank you for opening your heart and letting us in, even if it was just a little glimpse, vignettes, as they were.
Well, thank you for reading and receiving my vulnerability.
Let's talk about this
Yeah,
book. Yeah,
okay.
let's talk about this book because it's close to something that's going to come out from me, at least along the sense of belonging. I don't dive, however, into the aspects of loneliness, and that's a space where I don't think I've read very much of anything around loneliness. Maybe dabbled pieces of it in spiritual formation, but this is certainly a topic that is not widely written about, and I'm willing to bet it's because of the fear attached to it. I love your opening line, and this is, I don't know, this is like an author geek thing, that the intro and that chapter one was like, whoa, oh my. If this is where the rest of this book is going, then you're speaking my language. Your opening line in the intro in chapter one: if loneliness were placed on one side of a scale and belonging on the other, we might discover they carry the same weight. And in that, just line one, when I read that, there was a moment of trepidation, because if that's true, oh no, there's a little bit of fear that kind of crept in. It's like, they're the same. Oh, and that was just a pause, and I left it at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if we want to belong, the equal and opposite truth to that, if loneliness is the opposite of belonging, is that we're also lonely.
It seems as though this is a curation or of your collection of vignettes on loneliness.
I think so. The way I usually describe it is I explore various angles of loneliness and belonging in this book. And I think this book exists the way it exists because I knew I couldn't solve the problem of loneliness. And I knew there was no 10 steps to not be lonely anymore. So my approach with all of my writing and just about everything I do is to inhabit a posture of curiosity. And I became very curious about my loneliness, about others' loneliness. And the writing process just kind of takes me in different directions as a question comes up or as I read something. And these are the chapters that made the final cut. I feel like I wrote 3 or 4 books, and then this is the one that got published.
So you have a part 2 waiting in the wings.
No. Some of those things got thrown away because they needed to get thrown away. But I think I have more podcast episodes waiting in the wings, possibly.
Yeah. I think that you could, I wonder, are you the Brené Brown of loneliness? You can take that. Yeah. Coin that.
That would be cool. Yeah.
Loneliness is almost taboo culturally. I think, what did Brené Brown, what was her thing? Vulnerability, I think, to characterize. Loneliness is something that we don't really like to talk about. Why is that?
I think we are ashamed of it, right? And especially as Christians, we feel like there's something wrong with us. It's evidence that I don't have enough friends, or I don't have the right kind of relationships, or I'm not as close to God as I should be, or, there's something wrong with me. I can't connect to people. Or, I think there's all kinds of things people could say it's evidence of. And I disagree with all of that. Some of that may be true for some people, but it's pretty clear based on my own experiences and people I've talked to about loneliness is that people with all kinds of great friendships and partnerships and, intimacy with God still can struggle with loneliness. And there are different kinds of loneliness, and we experience it in different ways based on our season of life or our circumstances. So it's this, I think we feel shame, and then I think we're afraid of it because it's not in a box, right? If things aren't in boxes, we might never have answers for them. And I think we all like to have answers for things. I have moved away from that because that's the only way I can exist. And I'm more comfortable not having answers or letting questions result in more questions. So when people slow down and look at their own loneliness, it will take them into different directions about all different kinds of things. And I don't know if a lot of people really want to go there. But what I've discovered in writing and reading and speaking about loneliness is the more I am open about it and the more I voice my experiences with loneliness, the less power it has over me. And I think that's connected. Actually, Brené Brown talks about that with shame. When we bring it out into the open, it kind of dissipates. And we discover that we're not as alone as we thought we were because other people struggle with loneliness too. So, that means we're not as isolated and as different as we think we are.
I think we'll come back to that piece of isolation because that's very acute right now in our world of pandemic, of the feelings that you have in isolation. I don't know if they've canceled Christmas by you, but they just did that yesterday here. You're not alone in that struggle. The feelings that you're feeling, you're not alone in those feelings. Other people, we're all being confronted with the still voice in our minds and in our hearts. And it's really calling us to that falsehood of we're not enough. You just gave the example of, what was the word? We like to put it in a box, was it? It's almost because do you think it's because we want to find a formula to fix? I know that's kind of where I go. Something's wrong. Now I have to fix it.
I would say most of the, at least white American church, that's the approach. And I think people who aren't Christians, I think it's, this human thing to want to fix the problems and make everything better and be comfortable and make all of the bad stuff go away, or all of the hard stuff, all of the suffering go away.
But I mean, your premise here, isn't it? You're rooting in the notion loneliness is not a problem.
I would say loneliness doesn't have to be a problem. It's not always a problem. I do think loneliness can be a problem, and it can be a sign that some things are wrong, and you might need to think about. I mean, it can't. If you're lonely in your marriage, which I experienced loneliness and belonging in my marriage, but certain types of loneliness in your marriage or certain circumstances around that might mean that, like, you need therapy, and you need to maybe, if it's an abusive marriage and you feel alone because you're being abused, maybe you need to leave your marriage. So I loneliness, because it's not in a box, like, and it's connected to so many different aspects of life. I can't put parameters around it and say loneliness is not a problem or loneliness is a problem. Like, I don't mean to escape a definition. There are so many definitions of loneliness out there. And there's a lot of mystery around it. And I mean, I think that's part of it too. A lot of us don't like mystery.
Oh, I like that. I like that word. Hang on to that. There's a tweet for you. Mystery. That's so good. And perhaps it's a matter of that we each have our own experience and encounter with loneliness in a unique way.
Yeah. And I think the same is true for belonging, right? I think there's mystery in belonging. There are some things that make me feel that make me feel like I belong to myself or others and God that I can't explain.
Yeah. I love that.
Like a taste of, a meal with someone, and I take a bite and it sparks a memory of belonging, and I may not even know why. Maybe it was a meal I had 15 years ago. I mean, if I want to get really woo-woo on you, maybe it was a meal my mom had 15 years ago. Or had when she was pregnant with me. I don't know. Like, I do think there are ways we're connected and ways that we belong that aren't explainable easily or at all.
I'll have to sit with the mystery. There is mystery in loneliness and mystery in belonging. You should write a book on that.
I'm like, I wish I had a chapter on that in the book. You should write a chapter about it.
I think part of why people don't write on loneliness or mystery is that it will force you to confront your own stories on those. And who wants to do that? That's it. Part 1 was Charlotte Donlan. She is coming at us from her home in Birmingham, Alabama. Just finished reading one of Dr. King's book about his time there 60 years ago. Hey, there's a lot of history in that space and place for us to learn from, and so much to learn from Charlotte. I really value her vulnerability and her story. There is depth and wisdom in both. Pick up her book. Find her on Twitter as well. You can find Charlotte at Twitter and Instagram. Charlotte, just her name, Donlan, at Charlotte Donlan. Part 2 is coming up right now. Don't miss it, because we go even deeper. We start talking about the intricacies and the depth of her narrative, which is really her story that she shares in her book. So that's available right now on Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast. Don't miss it.